underlined something or you said, hey, this kind of struck me in this way, we'll start off with that and let me know. What's in the background of this psalm is the different sacrifices that were offered. And if you want to look at the different sacrifices, you can look at Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. I mean, that's a place where you can find sort of a description of all the different sacrifices that were offered. And this is, Psalm 50 is kind of contrasting the thank offering, the Todah. Remember we talked about that? In the first class, we talked about the Todah Psalms. So this is going to talk about the Todah and I think it's the Holah. Okay, this is the thank offering, or the thank sacrifice. Thank praise is what Todah means, but it is still a sacrifice. Okay, this one is more the burnt offering. So we'll talk about a little bit what those were. Most sacrifices were offered. Why? Because the worshiper sinned. They sinned in some way, so they would go to the temple and they would offer up a sacrifice. So there was the whole burnt offering, there was the sin offering, there was the guilt offering. You can find these described in the book of Leviticus. Now, when this animal was killed and sacrificed, most of the meat was burned up, or some of it would have been eaten by the priest. So it was a pretty good job to be a priest back in the day. To be a Levite, right? You just I get all the little good portions of people's sacrifices. The Todah was different, though. The Todah sacrifice was different because that was not so much a sacrifice for sin that you did, as much as, again, does anyone remember what the Todah sacrifice, why someone would offer it? What was the reason?
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving for what? For a special deed, right, done by God. Like a special thing that God did to save a person, right? So remember, there's that cycle where it's like the person's in trouble, they are being persecuted by an enemy, or they're sick or something, and then they cry out to God, and yet they also have confidence that they say, God, please deliver me, and if you deliver me, I will come back and offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And then God delivers them, and then they go to the temple, and they offer this sacrifice, and they have a group with them, and they will then eat the sacrifice. Not the priest, the person will eat it with their group. Like, it's going to be a feast, because there'd also be like baked goods, like breads and stuff too that you'd eat. Yeah, it was like Dr. Bergsma says, he's like, it's like having a picnic at the temple. Okay, I don't know where they ate this stuff, but it was outside. But you would do the sacrifice, and then you had the meal. And in the meal, again, you publicly proclaim to everybody what God had done for you in a spirit of praise, right? So a lot of the Psalms were written for Todah. Because when you were doing your lament part, guess what you would pray? You'd pray one of the Psalms of lament. Because my enemies are, crushing down on me, Then, when you experience deliverance, you would pray one of the Psalms of thanksgiving. In fact, the whole book of the Psalms has sort of a Todah shape because it moves from lament to praise. It's got that shape. Now, if the problem with the burnt offerings in Psalm, let's look at Psalm. So let's start diving into Psalm 50. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Oh, our God comes, he does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire, round about him a mighty tempest. The fire and wind, those were often signs that accompanied a manifestation of God, like on Mount Sinai, there was fire and there was wind. So this is like God in his glory and holiness. Our God comes, he does not keep silence. Okay. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare his righteousness, for God himself is judge. So here's God as a judge. Verse 7, hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I am God, your God. Here's God who's like the judge, and he's almost like the prosecutor. He's saying, I have evidence against you about something that I'm gonna now present. He says, I do not reprove you for your sacrifices. Your burnt offerings, that's that hola, your burnt offerings are continually before me. It's like you guys are always doing these burnt offerings, okay? But he says, verse 9, I will accept no bull from your house, nor he-goat from your folds. And you might stop and think, why not? Didn't he command that these sacrifices be made for sins? But he says, verse 10, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the air, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? So here he's saying, to stop right there, he's sort of saying, like, it was in the book of the law. It was these sacrifices. This was not something that, it was something that was commanded. It was part of the way worship was done. But as you can imagine, what tended to happen, people would burn the offering, the animal or whatever, on the altar, and the smoke goes up. And there was this idea that, look, I'm offering up this sacrifice to God in atonement for my sin. And it got to the point where if I'm offering this sacrifice, it almost became mechanical. Like, I've sinned, therefore I offer this sacrifice. I'm giving God what he wants. I'm giving God what he needs. Almost like I'm feeding God, Here you go, God. Here's this burned up animal, I did my part. What's missing from that? What do you think is missing from that? Sorry. The contrite heart, I mean, that's the point. And so anytime we have ritual, we can always, as human beings, fall away from doing the ritual with the true meaning that it's supposed to embody, right? We can be doing the ritual action without the disposition of the inward disposition of the heart. And that's what was happening in Psalm 50. And so God's like, I don't need you to feed me, basically. You're not doing me favors. I don't need you. In fact, the opposite's true. You need me. And so then in verse 13 it says, or verse 14, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And actually, Bergsma doesn't like the translation. I think this is a good translation of the Bible in general. I'm using the Revised Standard Version, Catholic edition, Second Catholic edition. But he actually makes a point. He says in the Hebrew, it really should mean not offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving, but offer to God a thanksgiving sacrifice. And you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, a sacrifice of thanksgiving can sound like, oh, if I give thanks to God, that's my sacrifice. But he's talking about a specific kind of sacrifice. He's saying offer the todah sacrifice, the thanksgiving sacrifice. So this is not a psalm that's saying ritual sacrifices aren't good. It's saying this is the special kind of ritual sacrifice that is pleasing. Pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline. You cast my words behind you. So there we go into all this where they're doing these sacrifices, but they don't have the right heart. Verse 18 says, if you see a thief, you are a friend of his, and you keep company with adulterers. Okay. And you speak evil with your tongue, etc., etc. You speak against your brother. You slander your mother's son. Verse 21, these things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. But he says in verse 23, he who brings thanksgiving as his sacrifice honors me. To him who orders his way aright, I will show the salvation of God. So it's interesting that ancient rabbis said when the Messiah would come, all the other sacrifices would cease except the Todah sacrifice. And this is an important thing to think about. The Messiah would put an end to all sin, so there wouldn't be a need for these other sacrifices, right? The sin offering, the guilt offering, these other kinds of the burnt offering, because sin will have been dealt with. So instead, all there will be left will be the thanksgiving sacrifice, because God has saved. Jesus comes, right, and he put an end to sin right on the cross. That doesn't mean that sin doesn't still happen, or that we don't still sin, or that our sin doesn't have an effect. But the atonement for the sin of the world has been made, right? That sacrifice has been made. That perfect sacrifice has been made. So all that is left to do is the thanksgiving sacrifice, the Todah, right? Yes?
Well, this is really a stickler thing that the Protestants refer to, or that Christ's sacrifice did it all.
Yep.
No good works are necessary. What do you say?
Right. So, well, a couple of things about that. Christ's sacrifice did it all. No good works are necessary. But if you remember, we just had in the second reading this past weekend, faith without works is dead. So works of charity are part of faith. That you can't separate them. They have to be there for a faith to be truly alive. Accepting the grace of God and then doing loving works through God's grace because of our faith. That's what's supposed to happen. But even though Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, redeemed the world and atoned for the sin, and his work was completed, it's also true that we still have to accept that, right? I mean, it's not that like just because Jesus died on the cross, everyone in the history of the world is now saved. You still have to accept that through faith. And if you said that to them, you would say, well, don't you believe that you still have to accept it in faith, right? And they would say, well, yeah, of course. Okay, so you do have to do something. Even though Jesus' work on the cross is done, you still have to do something. You have to accept it in faith, right? Of course, we would just say that you can lose that, that gift through serious sin. You have to persevere in faith. But what in the Eucharist, what if someone said to you, well, because this is an objection that our Protestant brothers and sisters will make sometimes. They'll say, well, you go to church and you have this Mass, and you call it the sacrifice of the Mass. But Jesus offered one sacrifice, the book of Hebrews says. One that was once and for all done. So what is this? What is the Mass? What is the Mass as a sacrifice? If we don't need sacrifice, we don't need to do any sacrifices for the forgiveness of sin anymore. What is the Mass? It's a continuation of the one, or as I like to say, it's a representation of the one sacrifice, right? So this is an important thing to kind of remember. We don't re-sacrifice Jesus, right, like every Mass. In fact, sometimes in old books what they would say, they would call the Mass the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, right? Because the bloody sacrifice was what happened 2,000 years ago on Calvary. The Mass is our thanksgiving Todah, where we make present again the sacrifice that happened once in time, but we bring it, it's made present again, so that we can receive the fruit of that, right? Because we weren't there 2,000 years ago at the cross, but through the Mass we can be there at that perfect sacrifice, right? And it's made present again. So there's a distinction between repeating a sacrifice infinitely that doesn't ever get the job done versus the job is done with Jesus' sacrifice, which was perfect, but it's just made present over and over again so that we can enter into the mystery of the cross, right? The death and resurrection. And so the Todah why is the Mass a Todah sacrifice? In what way is it a Todah sacrifice? Think about what are the components of a Todah.
Thanksgiving, isn't it?
It's in Thanksgiving, so we recount what God has done to save us, right? Especially in the Eucharistic prayer, in the readings. What else about it is a Todah? Right. Christ is the sacrifice. The Lamb of God is the sacrifice, made present again. What else about the Todah? Remember, this is different than the other.
He doesn't want the burnt offerings and things
Right. And how is the Mass different than the burnt? How is the Mass more like the Todah than the burnt offering?
Well, we're offering the body and blood of Christ, not an animal.
Right. Okay. What else? I'm looking for something else that was only done in the Todah.
Are we all coming together?
We're all coming together and
To
to praise God and give thanks and I can do this all night. No, I'm kidding.
We're offering ourselves too.
Yes, we are offering ourselves also. That's very beautiful. And
Are we all, yeah, are we all together in the church?
yeah, we're all in the church. And
Oh,
don't you all want to receive communion?
oh, yeah.
We eat the sacrifice, right?
Oh,
Actually, the Mass is interesting because the priest does eat, but he doesn't eat. It's not just the priest. And the priest is actually in the person of Christ, the high priest. But we all receive, we eat the sacrifice. That's what makes it like the Todah. It's the group brought together in that public thanks and praise where the sacrifice is eaten. Does that make sense? I mean, a lot of scholars will say the Passover, which, again, the Mass is based on the Passover because the Last Supper was a Passover meal. Many scholars will say basically the Passover was a form of the Todah meal, right? Why? Because what did they do every year at Passover? The family would get together. They would they would sacrifice the lamb. What would they tell? What was the story they would tell at the Passover? Huh? Yeah, the deliverance from slavery, the Exodus story, right? We were slaves and God delivered us and freed us. That's how God saved us. And they had to eat the whole lamb, right? Nothing could be left over the night before.
The big thing about Holy Thursday was that he went back, and he said he lost many of his disciples, and he said, "You've got to eat my body and drink my blood." But he didn't say how. And so Holy Thursday, he takes the commonest thing, bread and wine,
Yeah.
and uses them and shows them how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
How, and anointed,
Right.
So I thought that was the most important thing of Holy Thursday, but you're not saying that.
Well, no, I don't think what we're saying is not compatible. Yes, they eat. How do they eat his flesh and blood? And it's through the bread and wine.
That's what he
But
chose to use, yeah.
right, but I mean, it's not just regular bread and wine, right? It's blessed in the context of a Passover meal, which is done immediately before his passion, death, and resurrection, which is the way God, he anticipates, right? In the Eucharist, Jesus anticipates what he's going to do. He says, "This is my body, which is given up for you." It hasn't been given up yet, but he's going to do it, right? Do you ever think about that? Like when he says those words on the bread and wine, he hasn't suffered his passion yet, but he's doing it in anticipation. So then now when we do it, when we celebrate the Mass now, and that sacrifice is made present again, now that's a past event that is being recalled, right? And that we're entering into. But so the fact that he has bread and wine is important for a lot of reasons. I mean, when Melchizedek in the book of Genesis, is it Genesis 13, I think? In Genesis, Melchizedek comes. He is a priest from Salem, and he has bread and wine. That's his offering, right? Bread and wine had a place in the Passover meal, and he takes the bread and wine and blesses them. But basically, the bread and wine becomes his body and blood, which is the lamb, right? There's no lamb, right? They don't eat a lamb. We don't have lamb at Mass, right? Right? He is the lamb, but his body and blood are symbolized by the bread and wine, and they indeed become more than just symbolic. They actually become his body and blood, his flesh and blood. But you're right. Also, bread and wine are common things. They were staples. That would have been why. There could be many reasons why certain things, God chose to do certain things or to set up certain institutions or sacraments the way they are, right? Water, think about baptism, water, all the meanings that water had for the people at the time. Water was necessary to live. It was cleansing, but it was also necessary for life, and it was also has all this. It was an important image in terms of creation and new creation with the flood, and so there's also.
I always ask this, and then I'll shut up. But why do you drop a little water in with the wine? Is the water us in the sacrifice?
So that's a good question. Why the water goes into the wine? I have a hard time recalling parts of the Mass if I'm not saying them. But through the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. So the water going into the wine is symbolic of the divinity and humanity coming together. Well, both, right? Who was Jesus? He had a fully human nature and a fully divine nature. Then, when we receive him through the sacraments, we have a human nature, but we are in a way divinized. We receive his divine grace, right? We don't become gods, but we get a share in the divine life. So there's a marrying of the divine and human, isn't that what heaven is? Heaven is us being in the presence of God. Right? So I think in short answer, what does the water going into the wine mean? I think it means the merging of the divine and the human. That happens through Christ.
And that is the symbolic thing of Christ himself. We're not involved.
No, we are involved because we're receiving him, right?
Well, we're
So here's the exact prayer.
Well,
Through the divinity.
actually are not. I'm sorry.
Well, here's the prayer. I have to look at a missal to say it. Through the mystery of this water and wine, may we who come to share.
In his humanity.
Let's read it. I got it on my phone. I can't. There's very few parts of the Mass I have totally memorized. And
Mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity.
okay.
Right?
Yep. So let me find it so I can read it and recount it. Okay. Okay. I'll go through all the Eucharistic prayers. Okay, yeah, because it's after. It also has a symbolic meaning of what does it mean when the bread is consecrated and then the wine is consecrated separately. What happens when you separate body from blood? What is that called? When blood is taken away from a body? What does that usually result in? Death. So what happens when you put them back together? It's life, new life. Yeah, so there's a resurrection imagery in that as well. Yeah. So here is, may this mingling of the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ bring eternal life to us who receive it. So, I don't know. I'm totally lost. I can't think of what that prayer was.
If you're going to look it up, we'll
Oh, okay, wait. So I'm sorry. We're talking about two different things. I'm not like in the Mass. It's hard for me to. The first thing is pouring water into the wine before the consecration. Yeah. Okay, and that is now I was starting to think about the fracturing of the Blessed Sacrament, the fracturing of the host, and then dropping it. But the first thing is preparing the presentation of the gifts, where the priest is preparing the wine. And saying, I know, Rick, you have it memorized, but I don't, and I can't talk about it unless I can see it written down. By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ. May we come to share in the divinity of Christ.
Sure, and that's what?
Who humbled himself to share in our humanity. So just as Jesus, who was God, the Son divine, just as he humbled himself to share our human nature, so may we go the other direction, and may we come to share in the divinity, his divine nature, because we receive him.
Okay, I was wrong.
So here's a quote, Marita, that I can't remember if it was Ignatius of Antioch or St. Irenaeus, but the quote was, God became man so that man can become God. Now again, that doesn't mean that we become like this Mormon idea, like we become the gods of our own planets, no. But it means that God took a share of human life so that we could have a share in the divine life. That's that direction, right?
But in communion, the accidents
Mm-hmm.
are the host and the wine. If you went to church and they didn't give you a chance to take the blood, the wine, if you just took the host, which is still the body
Yeah, I mean,
he doesn't come into us, he takes.
well, he does though.
invites
He
himself
I
up.
would say he does come into us. I think.
I don't think he invites himself up.
No. Wait. Well, no. We don't want to. He still enters into us. Right? I mean, what do we say? Lord, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. He still comes to our heart. God is not, to say that doesn't mean that God is like cutting it parts and here's a part of me and you get a part of me and you get a part of me. No, it's just that he does enter into our soul.
You really think so?
Yeah, I think the church teaches that. I mean, right? Is that like, you know?
Okay.
I mean, I think it's, I see what you're saying, that God, brings us up into him. Well, I mean, they're kind of two ways of looking at the same thing. I mean, and that's the thing, because of the incarnation, Jesus said, I am really going to come into you.
Sure.
You know?
And in the host is the DNA and everything. I mean, he's not bodily there, but.
It's a sacrament.
Presence
It's a
is
mystical,
there.
I mean, it's a real presence, but it's not,
Real.
right, it's not like, we don't want to make the mistake of saying like, okay, I am chewing on, like a piece of the body, and it's like,
Right.
we don't want to be physicalist, like, it is still a sacrament. It's still a mystery. It's a sacrament. It's a real, full, true presence, but it's a sacramental presence. So we just have to like be careful.
You're not saying that when we take him in, we become one with him.
We are united. That's what communion
We are
means.
united.
Communion means union with.
He's not united with us. We're united with him.
Well, what's the difference?
Big difference.
I don't think so. He's
I'm sorry.
to be united. Okay, here, I'll give you an analogy, and don't freak out about this analogy, but when a husband and wife are in the act of marital love, aren't they both united with each other? Did you say that one's united with the other, but the other one's not with them? I mean, no, it's a union, right?
I don't.
When two things are united, aren't they just united? I mean,
No, this is. I mean, love is beautiful, and that act is absolutely beautiful. But we're talking about the presence of Christ coming down on the altar in the host, and then coming to us.
but it's about union. It's about, see, even marital love is a reflection of divine union with man. I mean, that's actually the theology of the body, that the marital love is actually just it's a reflection of divine love for us, for human beings, right? That's why it's a good thing, because it's, so I guess what I'm saying is
Well, I think in that we're both equal.
union is union. We're equal. I mean, we're not equal. It's not about being equal. It's an act of humility that God condescends to become man in the first place.
Yeah.
And that he's able to be, that he makes his presence perceivable through bread and wine, right? Like even just what appears to be bread and wine, but which is more, that's a tremendous condescension. The fact that Jesus is present in the church right now and just remains there, that's a tremendous humbling on the part of God. So it's not that like, so it's an act of humility on the part of God that he allows us to receive him. It's not like, I don't know, I think you're stuck on this idea that like God's greater than us, so we can't receive God.
No.
He loves us, so he wants us to receive him.
Yeah. He almost,
So we'll just keep thinking about this, but we're going to move on. Yeah.
Sorry.
Back to the original thing that started this last dialogue, the blood and water now that's been raised earlier than most of you in the state branches. The water was put in because the last act of the bleeding of Christ was when the soldier pierced him on the side and blood and water came out. I'll read you St. John 19:34. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water.
Yeah.
And that is symbolic of the last bleeding of Christ. He was bleeding all the time, but the last bleeding was that. So that is, I hate to use the word symbolic, but
Well, the Mass has, right.
is symbolic of that.
The Mass has a lot of little parts in it that are symbolic. I mean, there are some historians who would say part of the reason why they put water in wine is because that's what that's how they cut wine. They put water into wine. It was an ancient practice they always did. Now, the church can do that, and then it can also take on symbolic or like, oh, this also more deeply means this, That's fine. So, yeah, it can have those meanings. Yep. Right.
side, and then you also do it again.
Well, okay, so there's that's a question about the missal. So the missal's not clear. The Roman missal presumes that if you are going to have communion under both kinds, meaning the host and the chalice, it's written in a way that it presumes you're going to have one cup on that's it. You know what I'm saying? So what it says is water is to be poured into the chalice. It doesn't say water is to be poured into the glass cruet, which I know most priests do. There's two things that you're required to do. You're required to use wine mixed with water for consecration, and you're required to pour a drop of water into the chalice, not the cruet, the chalice. So what I do is before Mass, I try to satisfy, and I research this as a priest because I'm like, they never taught us this, and the missal is unclear. The missal's unclear, the rubrics. So what I do is before Mass starts, I pour a little water into the wine, and that's satisfied that one requirement. And then the other thing is that's why I just pour it into my own chalice. Yeah. But I know different priests do different things, and it's not clearly, the rubrics weren't written in mind that you were going to have, because, the communion under both kinds was brought back. And when that missal was first created after Vatican II, a lot of people weren't doing the cup to the people. So it just wasn't written clearly. That's why I do that, though. Okay, let's go to Psalm 51. Okay, Psalm 51. This is a great psalm. We're not going to spend too much long because it's after 8 o'clock. So this is a classic psalm, right? Psalm 51 was written after David. What was the context? What happened? Yes. After David committed adultery with Bathsheba and then did what? Killed Uriah the Hittite, her husband. A double whammy. Double whammy mortal sins action going on there, right? And David is sort of obviously like crushed because he's David. He's supposed to be this leader of God's people and this embodiment of all the virtues, right? As the leader of God's holy people. He's anointed, right? All these things. So his kind of like fear is, how could God ever forgive me? But he never despairs, right? So, so anyways, okay. This psalm is also sometimes called the Miserere, which comes from the Latin word for the beginning of the psalm in Latin, which would have mercy on me. So you hear things like famous musical pieces.
Said that on his day. He said, "Wait a minute."
Like this is. So you